Hello, my name is Elena Blackwelder. I'm a sophomore at Meredith College, and I will be presenting my research on the effects of an affective education. Despite the hope that Americans make their political decisions based on rational thinking and logic, reality shows that attitudes towards government and policies are shaped early in life through an educational experience that creates affective alliances that organize the emotions on which voters base their political decisions. Affectively loaded symbols and phrases used in civics and social studies curriculums form political emotions that surface later in life, but students have been ill-equipped to evaluate and rationalize their decisions. Rather than being naturally developed over time, political ideologies are historically constructed because social studies is what turns students into American citizens. Utilizing words and phrases that are affectively tied to progressive or conservative ideals may influence students' political beliefs during these formative years. Although a student's education may prime their actions and reactions no matter the effort of a teacher or parent, social studies curriculums are the spaces where American identity is shaped, and it is having a clear impact on the competence of the electorate. The foundation of affect theory can be traced back to playwright and Princeton psychologist Sylvan Tompkins. It was Tompkins' theatrical experiences that inspired his work on the concept of affect because he wanted to study the relationships between actors, audiences, and emotion. Although the words in the script may be crucial to the plot and understanding of the play, it is not what makes the play great. Instead, expression, gesturing, pauses in dialogue, and staging are all essential elements to a successful production that evokes strong emotions and reactions from the audience. As affect theory scholar Donovan Schaefer describes it, quote, a play's success is measured by its ability to deliver a feast of affects. When applied to cultural, historical, and political studies, affect provides a method of analysis that focuses on why and how actions and reactions occur rather than the sequence of events. Affect theory, in the decades since Tompkins first worked to develop it, has been dissected, expanded upon, and debated, resulting in a variety of interpretations. The Deleuzian school of thought includes scholars such as Brian Massumi, Felix Guattari, and Eric Schaus. This interpretation of affect theory relies on the recognition that affect is an active entity, never passive. Affect exists everywhere at all times and is constantly working to charge the atmosphere of a situation. However, it is essential to note that these scholars do not make a strong connection between affect and emotion. Instead, they believe that the two are separate entities, and that when an emotion is connected to an affect, that means that the individual is no longer experiencing the affect. Deleuze states that affect cannot be converted into or delimited by the discursive, by images or representations, by consciousness or thought, and has, quote, a form of bodily meaning that can pierce social interpretations by often undoing social expectations and logic. Essentially, affect is not able to be described by simply the languages and labels that are already understood and makes itself larger than predetermined discourse by interrupting that which was already known. Brian Massumi has become one of the most notable names in affect theory due to his work in translating Deleuze and expanding upon his claims. He states that emotion is subjective content and serves as a sociolinguistic fixing of the quality of an experience, which is from that point onward defined as personal. Emotion limits affect by only allowing what is describable. Affect, on the other hand, is the precursor to emotionally charged actions and reactions. Affect is the result of the intensification of an atmosphere and urges reactions out of people experiencing a situation. It is unlimited by discourse and, as such, cannot be universally described. What is significant about Masumi's interpretation of affect in terms of intensity is how it relates to the development and distribution of power. In the same way that affect and intensity can be amplified or dampened, so can power. Various forces, both linguistic and non linguistic, may interact in order to amplify or propel power into a space or situation. Masumi claims that affect is essential to rethinking postmodern power after ideology, because ideology is no longer encompassing despite its sometimes malignant presence. Eric Schaus, a cultural critic, makes a similar statement that the power of the media resides not so much in their ideological affects, but their ability to create affective resonances independent of content or meaning. A more recent scholar who has been able to make a distinct connection between affect and politics is Jonathan Haidt. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Haidt defines 6 moral foundations of politics, all of which can be connected to symbols, phrases, policies, etc. These foundations are care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. By appealing to these foundations, politicians are able to gain voters' support and stir feelings of resentment, fear, or hate for the opposing candidates. People's responses to foundational appeals are guided very little by reason, instead, relying on an instinctive reaction and subsequent emotion to determine feedback. Traditionally, liberal ideologies have failed to evoke significant response to all 6 moral foundations, which has led them to maintaining less power and influence in society. Alternatively, conservative ideologies are typically more effective in reaching all 6 moral foundations and swaying voters' opinions. In order to gain more widespread support, Haidt claims, Democrats need to understand how to connect policies to the unum of e pluribus unum, rather than simply the pluribus. In recent decades, the American public education system experienced an immense shift in dynamic and organization. Around the same time that students of all backgrounds and races were finally making some headway with the federal government in addressing their oppression, the Cold War was beginning, and the public education system began experiencing what could be categorized as a revolution. Sonia Douglas Horsford describes this change as a transition from educational equality to educational excellence, a phrase that can contradict itself depending on how the system is viewed. For students, particularly white students, the goal of education had always been relatively simple: to learn the foundation of knowledge necessary to either enter the workforce or pursue higher education. This basic knowledge was intended to give students a relatively equal playing field during their formative years. Education was seen as a cost and an investment in America's future. However, as educational excellence was encouraged instead of equality, capitalism began to hold a larger influence over schools and school systems than had been previously allowed. Public schools began to train their students to fulfill the idea of American exceptionalism. President Reagan perpetuated the idea that America needed to be the greatest country in the world and subsequently initiated the educational reform movement as it is known today with the Nation at Risk report in 1983. This was followed by transitioning from a public investment approach to education to school choice and high stakes testing. This approach has led to the separation of students into high maintenance and low maintenance categories, in which high maintenance students typically have lower test scores, may have special needs, and are often from low income and minority families. These students are disproportionately forced out of classrooms and disciplined in order to maintain a good reputation for the schools within their communities. When considered in regards to social studies and civics lessons, this means that there is less diversity in the perspective of those building a curriculum to define the country's culture. These students are, in turn, becoming affectively charged, which has long term impacts on their education and success. If teachers and administrators are being primed to see these students as less than, then negative affects towards these students are intensifying the longer they maintain the label of high maintenance. Further, teacher certification has changed from requiring that dispositions are guided by fairness, honesty, responsibility, and social justice to now removing social justice from those requirements. This is because right-wing organizations have claimed that there is a link between social justice and the promotion of political ideology in teacher education. Though, in Michel Foucault's terms, those with authority shifted their methods of information dispersal in order to maintain the traditional power structure. The fundamental flaw in this capitalistic approach is that it fails to understand that if people are treated as customers instead of citizens, the skills of citizenship and political engagement will atrophy. Schools are no longer teaching students to be effective American citizens, and teachers are not being trained to promote political engagement. As political engagement decreases, so does American cultural activity, because when people are disconnected from government, they fail to participate in a connected society. Students then must rely on messaging from candidates and political parties to decide for or whom they wish to vote, if they want to vote. This leaves them more susceptible to persuasion based on the moral foundations that they have been taught to prioritize in school, particularly loyalty and liberty in the form of American exceptionalism. In addition to this, civics and history courses have had their curriculums determined on a state by state basis, creating substantial disparities in what events students are taught and the perspective in which they're taught. Perhaps the most distinct example of this inconsistency can be found in the differences between California and Texas in the same social studies textbooks. The textbooks have the same publisher, the same authors, and cover the same events. However, they are customized for each state in order to correspond with each state's specific civics and history curriculum requirements. This has effectively politicized and affectively charged the lessons themselves. For instance, students in California, a traditionally progressive state, will learn that some rulings on the Second Amendment allow for some gun regulations, whereas there is no such blurb for students in Texas. In Texas, a traditionally conservative state, students will read that some critics dismissed the quality of the literature produced during the Harlem Renaissance, but Californian students will not find this argument in their textbook. The Second Amendment and civil rights movement, among many others, are being affectively charged in the classroom in a way that can compel students to align themselves with certain political ideologies. These variations and amplifications of affective atmospheres only serve to divide the country and make a shared history more ambiguous. Despite the wide ranging differences in public school curricula, the true disparity is in the lack of clarification by teachers. Whereas teachers could serve as moderators for civil classroom debate over topics such as gun regulations and the civil rights movement, they are instead discouraged from sharing a range of political ideas, appealing to or sharing several moral foundations, and providing insight for students' consideration. Research by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences shows that, quote, neither the federal government nor the states have made high quality civics education a priority, and that, quote, fewer high school civics courses are being offered now than in the past. Further, since the generation that is now in power left high school, the number of civics and government courses completed by students has declined. Public policy scholar Martin West found that in the years since the No Child Left Behind Act was passed, there is a reduction in time spent on social studies instruction in elementary schools. The decision to require civics courses and what their lessons should include has been described, ironically, as a political process. The actions taken to include or exclude civics courses, limit instruction in textbooks, and prevent teachers from engaging in civil discourse with students are not without consequences. A 2016 survey by the Annenberg Public Policy Center found that only 26% of Americans can name all three branches of government, and public trust in government is at only 18%, and voter participation has reached its lowest point since 1996, barring the 2020 general election. Although there was increased youth interest in the 2016 election, only 23% of eighth graders performed at or above proficient level on the civics portion of the National Assessment for Education Progress. Contrast these percentages with the fact that 3 in 4 people can name all of the Three Stooges, and the significance of the problem becomes very clear. Schools are no longer producing students that are capable of taking part in their country's government or making informed decisions about policies in the nation. Instead, they are encouraging decision making based on the ideals of what America should and can be, the morals activated by exceptionalism, and which messaging best aligns with the information and history that have been shared in school. Shapiro and Brown argue that educators must also remember that civics is not synonymous with history, and that while increasing history courses are potential steps to augment students' background knowledge and skill sets, civics is a narrow and instrumental instruction that provides students with the agency to apply these skills. It is the application of the learned skills that is a key factor. To conclude, the shift in educational structures can be linked to the shift in political dynamics nationwide. Voters are becoming increasingly spiteful and divided, and facts have failed to be considered universally true. This can be directly explained by the intensification of affective alliances and atmospheres and the morals on which we base our political ideologies. As the purpose and execution of public education has shifted and become more politicized, it is work to encourage stronger connections between students and certain political parties. In Texas, social studies and civics curriculums are creating affective bonds with conservative ideals and morals, whereas curriculums in California are creating affective bonds with liberal ideals and morals. If Haidt's argument that affect primes human nature is true, or that people's actions and reactions are organized in advance of experience, then classrooms are where this organization and amplification is occurring. However, it is likely impossible to remove affect altogether from social studies and civics curriculums. Instead, it is key to apply moral foundations theory in such a way that it encourages students to improve discourse and face situations in which their affective intensities or alliances are challenged. History courses need to teach a complete timeline and provide accurate information about the events of America's past, rather than emphasizing American exceptionalism in order to provide students with the opportunity to employ rational thinking when developing their moral ideologies and affective alliances. Granted, simply changing one subject in an entire lifetime of education will not prevent strong affective alliances or ensure that a student's education is as fulfilling as possible. Rather, it is the first step in reevaluating how affect is implemented and explored in the classroom, and it allows for new room in education reform. If the chain of authority is redirected and parents and teachers and students are given more control and authority in creating civics and history curriculums, then it is possible to improve the moral foundations on which students' ideologies are built and produce a more honest and fair political discourse. Thank you.